evening. I'm William Fowler, Head of Mission of the Embassy of Mexico. On behalf of Ambassador Josefa González Blanco, it is my great honor to give you the warmest welcome to the residents of Mexico in London as part of the activities to commemorate 211 years of Mexico's independence and the Bicentennial of its consummation. Ambassador González Blanco had to travel to Mexico. She regrets not being here. She left her kind regards. I want to express my appreciation for special guests joining us this evening. After almost 18 months of disruption caused by the global pandemic, events like the talk Professor Will Fowler will deliver today bring us closer to a sense of renewed yet cautious normality. That is why, while we must limit the number of attendees in person, the Embassy of Mexico wanted to engage as many people as possible, taking the advantage of technology. To our audience following us via social media, I wish to thank you for your virtual presence. Today, 27 September, marks 200 years since the entry of the army commanded by Agustin Iturbide to Mexico City, sealing the end of the Mexican War of Independence, a popular movement that initiated the father of the nation, Miguel Hidalgo, 11 years before. On this occasion, we organized a conference conceived for an English-speaking audience and beyond to convey to a broader public the meaning and significance of these historical events for world history. In the context of the tumultuous early 19th century marked by social unrest and revolution, the process culminated in the independence of Mexico, added to the struggles for liberation and anti-colonialism, and advanced the cause of liberty and freedom in the American continent. To discuss these pivotal episodes and their importance and their impact on the evolution and consolidation of Mexico as a rising nation, I am extremely pleased to introduce our main speaker this evening. Professor Will Fowler is a lecturer of Latin American Studies at the University of St. Andrews and an international member of the Mexican Academy of History. He is the author of several books in both English and Spanish, in which he is fluent, on 19th century Mexico, most recently, Independent Mexico, the Pronunciamiento in the Age of Santa Anna, 1831-1858, and La Guerra de Tres Años, 1857-1861, el conflicto del que nació el Estado laico mexicano. He has published numerous articles and edited 14 volumes on Mexican and Latin American political history, including the co-edition with Professor Marcela Terrazas from UNAM of a comprehensive anthology on early Mexican-British relations, Diplomacia, Negocios y Política, ensayos sobre la relación entre México y el Reino Unido en el siglo XIX. Overall, Professor Fowler is a fantastic chronologist of a particular fascinating period for Mexico and a great friend of the embassy. As Lord Acton once noted, and I quote, "History is not a burden of the memory, but an illumination of the soul." Without a doubt, a close and compassionate look at the characters and the events that made possible the birth of Mexican nation bears the power to illuminate not only our collective past, but present challenges and future endeavors. On that note, it is a great pleasure to leave you with Professor Will Fowler, who is set to shed new light on the origin, process, and outcome of Mexico's War of Independence and the central role of the Plan of Iguala 200 years ago. Thank you, Professor Fowler, and enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you, William Fowler, for those extremely kind words. I would like to thank Her Excellency the Mexican Ambassador, Josefa González Blanco. I appreciate that she can't be here, but it's still thank you for this invitation and for helping with the organization of this event. I would like to thank in particular the Head of Cooperation and Education Affairs for being on this. Thank you very much. And clearly, Vicky Perez as well, for allowing me to be here. I'm asked to be here. And thank you for being here. It is a very special occasion. It is an extremely special occasion for a number of reasons. The obvious one is that it is 200 years. 200 years to this day that 16,000 troops, former insurgents, former royalists, people who had fought against each other since 1810, were now brought together in the army of the Three Guarantees. More on them later. That followed Agustín de Iturbide and Vicente Guerrero, who had come together and marched into Mexico City. It happened to be Agustín de Iturbide's birthday, his 38th birthday. And they marched into Mexico City, and in so doing brought an end, a definitive end, to the control that Spain had over the viceroyalty of New Spain. And I'll say a bit more about that, because obviously that we can argue as to whether this independence was truly achieved precisely on the 27th. But the 27th does have that definitive impact. It's a moment of an end, and it's a moment of a beginning. It's the beginning of the Mexican state. And that, I think, it certainly deserves a celebration. It certainly deserves a talk. And for me, it is also extremely special because I feel extremely honored and privileged that I've been invited to give this talk here in the Mexican Embassy, a bit of suelo patrio mexicano here in the United Kingdom, and that we are able to do this in person as well. After a year and a half of lockdowns and speaking to what has felt like speaking to the microwave oven day in, day out, as my colleague Mateo Terrazas in the UNAP has kind of described this experience. So what I'd like to do today, in a way, is to talk about this moment and its importance, and in a way use this occasion, in a way, to remind ourselves of what the War of Independence entailed, and how it came to an end. And in so doing, in a way, recognize the importance of Agustín de Iturbide in bringing together the kind of negotiation that allowed for, ultimately, after 11 years of war, 11 years of horrific war, actually the kind of consensus and reconciliation that allowed for this plan of Iguala on the 24th of February 1821 to, in a matter of 6-7 months, bring about the achievement of independence comparatively, relatively peacefully. Okay, so that is what today's talk is about. Just make sure that I don't get too carried away and speak now until next morning. But clearly, talking about this bicentenary, in a way, does come with a certain amount of controversy, and I will address that first. In a way, today what we are marking, literally, is 200 years from the liberation of Mexico City. That is the kind of the concrete aspect. That is when, on the 27th of September 1821, the Ejército Integrante marched into Mexico City. And so goes one of the folkloric stories is that they could have gone an obvious route, but they didn't. They took a slight detour unexpectedly, so that Iturbide could wave to his mistress, like Guerilla Rodriguez. But one way or another, it was a remarkable moment. And it was a moment that, at the time, was experienced as a moment of true jubilation. And there's a wonderful book by Javier Campo called Las Ideas de un Día, the ideas of the day, which capture that day and how it was expressed in poetry, in the press. This moment of 11 years of war, 11 years of war had ended. A war that, in fact, had been horrific, especially the first 6 years of those 11 years. And that now, finally, this was done. And it was done with the hope that Spain would not reject this formula of independence, because the plan of Iguala actually, I'll say a bit more about this in a moment, offered the throne of Mexico to Ferdinand VII, for somebody within his dynasty, but stated that if they rejected it, notwithstanding that, then a Junta de Gobierno, a junta, would decide who would bear the crown, and of course it would be eventually Iturbide. But at that moment in time, this was a moment of hope. And a lot of the books that I've written, in a way, dwell on the loss of that hope, and how the dream of independence then was not fulfilled, and how the 3 decades followed of disappointments and fighting, and ultimately it was a war against the United States. But today we're not going to talk about that. Today we're going to dwell on the moment, this moment of liberation. And in a way, of course, we are talking today about marking the bicentennial of Mexican independence. It's not the 15th of September.
No.
It's not the 16th of September. It's the 27th of September that independence was achieved by the capture of Mexico City. It's true that in Veracruz, the Spaniards held on, and it took another month for Santa Anna away with the Rincon brothers, although they were fighting amongst themselves, but to eventually liberate the port of Veracruz. And it's true that in the port of Veracruz, in the island of San Juan de Ulúa, there was a garrison which the Spaniards held on to until the 18th of November, 1825, bombing the port occasionally. And let us not forget that Spain actually attempted a reconquest of Mexico in the summer of 1829, when the Brigadier Isidro Barradas, set off from Cuba, arrived in Tampico and was defeated there by none other than, of course, Antonio López de Santa Anna in the famous Battle of Tampico of the 11th of September, 1829. And from a Santanista perspective, and having written a biography of Santa Anna, I do have a slight Santanista kind of tendency. That was actually the 11th of September, the day that independence was truly consolidated. But that was what the Santanistas said. But in terms of bicentenaries, the 27th is the date. The 15th of September was Porfirio Díaz's birthday. And Porfirio Díaz decided to, because as we all know, the War of Independence began on the 16th of September 1810, when his father, Miguel Hidalgo de Costilla, summoned everybody at 2 o'clock in the morning in his parish in Dolores, in the village of Dolores, and made a cry, not of independence, he did not talk of independence, but a cry of an end to el mal gobierno, the bad government, and launched what became the War of Independence. But at that point, independence was not what was being said. It was a rejection of Spaniards, it was a rejection of the way Spain had treated Mexico, and it was showing loyalty to Ferdinand VII at that point in time. This would change by 1813, more on that later. But so, in fact, the 16th of September was when the War of Independence began. The fact that we celebrated it on the 15th, we owe that to Porfirio Díaz because it was his birthday, and he chose to kind of launch this, that tradition is kept. But today is a special day, and I think it is special that although, as we will see in a minute, this controversy continues, no? Today, for example, there would be a parade in Mexico City. So that it is being marked. And as you will see a bit later today, the new 20 peso note has the image of the entrance of the Figurante army into Mexico City with the figure who will be the very small, but he's there. And in a way that resonates with the way that independence was actually celebrated in the 19th century, up until 1864. So in fact, following the achievement of independence on the 27th of September 1821, gradually juntas patrióticas were formed, and they organized every year kind of a celebration of independence. And already it becomes evident, as has been studied by Verónica Sara de Toscano, but also by other historians, including Michael Costello and Flora Maria Salazar Mendoza, who've looked at these juntas patrióticas and how different factions preferred to celebrate, for ideological reasons, they preferred to celebrate Hidalgo rather than Iturbide and vice versa. But actually, on a number of occasions, those two dates were celebrated. So there wasn't necessarily this antagonism that developed subsequently. And in fact, going back to my friend Santa Anna, the 6 times that Santa Anna was president of Mexico, not 11, 6 times he was president of Mexico, still quite many times, they would celebrate the 16th because they were celebrating the beginning of the War of Independence. They would celebrate the 27th because that was the achievement of independence. And they would celebrate the 11th of September because that was what they called the consolidation of independence. So that was a good time to fight. And depending on when, for example, if Anastasio Bustamante was president, and he was president actually for a longer period of time than Santana, but I can't forget that, he would actually organize a parade like we have today, where actually veterans of the Ejército Real who were still alive would ride ahead and kind of part of those celebrations. But it's true that increasingly, as we come to the mid-19th century, liberals tended to identify with Hidalgo, and conservatives, as we started to have liberals and conservatives in the mid-19th century, with Iturbide. And then, at that point, by the mid-19th century, you start to have a conflict between republicanism and monarchism. So the conservatives started to kind of see the possibility after these 3 decades of unhappiness and kind of disillusion, and maybe we have lost our way by becoming Republicans and we need to bring back a monarchy. And it was in that context that we can show you that one, the Guerra de 3 años, or the monarchy wasn't actually a feature issue there, or the Guerra de Reforma from 1857 to 61. And it is after that conflict that from the liberal perspective, clearly we cannot celebrate Iturbide on the 27th because that is like celebrating a monarchist and a monarchy. And when you have the French intervention, the big paradox is that although the French intervention from 1864 to 67 results in the imposition, with the support of Mexican conservatives, of Maximilian of Austria as the Emperor of Mexico, is actually Maximilian, who was a liberal, much to the horror and surprise of the conservatives, who in 1864 stopped celebrating the 27th of September. That is the paradox of history. And since then, really, obviously, in terms of when we think of independence, who do we celebrate? It's Hidalgo. And it's the 16th of September, with the Grito of the 15th. And at school, this is a drawing that my daughter, Effie, drew when there was a year that I was researching Santa Ana in Jalapa, in Veracruz, and our children went to schools in Jalapa. And she was only 5, and they were, at the age of 5, she was asked to draw the símbolos patrios, the patriotic symbols. Who was Hidalgo? Draw. And this is her drawing. It's fantastic drawing for a 5-year-old. Yeah. There's Hidalgo ringing the bell with the flag. And I mentioned Veronica Sala that her research has shown that, for example, there are over 800 streets in Mexico City alone named after Hidalgo, whilst only about 150 make reference to Iturbide. So clearly, we have this idea of an official history that has ultimately created this sense of this is the man we celebrate, and we're going to celebrate the man who actually brought the war to him. And he is in a way forgotten in ways, in the sense that, from a British perspective, educated Britons will know about Simon Bolivar. We will have heard of Simon Bolivar and how he campaigned from Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and maybe way down to Peru, up to Bolivia, and liberated all of that. We will have heard of Jose San Martin, Ismael from Argentina, over the Andes into Chile, helped the liberation of Chile, on a boat, went to Peru, and was also part of that process. And we may accept that Bolivar actually tried to form his final constitution. It wasn't monarchy, but it wasn't monarchy in anything but name. It kind of was hereditary with him kind of forever there as. But I mean, interestingly, something like Bolivar, there's a statue of him just outside here in the main square, has been adored by conservatives and liberals, from Hugo Chavez on one hand to more conservatives. But Iturbide hasn't enjoyed that kind of prominence, although there are some supporters of Iturbide. And the reason for that is, one, that he was a royalist to begin with. So during the first part of the War of Independence, he fought for the royalists against Hidalgo, Morelos, and company, and was quite a sanguinary and royalist officer. I'm not here to kind of praise Iturbide. It's not about somebody saying what a great guy he was. I'm more into understanding the context in which these historical figures moved. But it was a war, it was a war, and similarly, Hidalgo and Morelos, they were committing atrocities. It's a war. But the main issue with Iturbide is that following the achievement of independence, with the royal family in Spain rejecting the crown, he allowed himself to be proclaimed Emperor of Mexico in May 1822. And he became Emperor Agustin I. And when he became emperor, he clashed with Congress. He started off as a constitutional monarchy, but he clashed with Congress. He closed down Congress. He was kind of fairly repressive in that sense. And he had centralist tendencies which clashed with the provincial deputations and the kind of federalist tendencies that were already kind of there. And somebody like Will Fowler started a series of pronunciamientos that ultimately forced his abdication in 1853. He went into exile, came here. He was in London. And then he returned to Mexico in 1824 thinking that he could resolve the chaos that he had left behind. I mean, not knowing that a decree had been passed that if he stepped in Mexico, he would be shot. And that's what happened. He arrived in Mexico, he was accused of being a traitor, and he was executed in Padilla, in Tamaulipas. And because that is his end, in a way, that's the legacy that we seem to remember of him, and that is perhaps explains why he's a forgotten hero. But, at the end of the day, he was responsible for the plan of Iguala, which is why we're talking now, and he was responsible for the achievement of independence. So let's kind of pause and think about that extraordinary achievement. But in order to understand it, in order to understand how he did it, it is important to get a sense of what the War of Independence entailed. And the kind of questions that you can see on the slide, in a way, capture much of the debate that has been ongoing in academia for years and years and years, not so decades, right? Are we talking about the War of Independence as a war of national liberation? In a way, many historians would argue that it wasn't a war of national liberation, not from the context of the people who lived it. That this is a kind of superimposition that has come subsequently because it resulted in independence. We see it as a war of national liberation. But Hidalgo, Morelos Beso, Hidalgo avoids talking about independence and retains this idea of being loyal to the Crown of Spain and Ferdinand VII. The issues with the Spaniards that are local there and the grievances are local grievances, that's the way the Bourbon reforms, the long-term idea. I'll say more about that in a minute, I think. Social revolution. Certainly, some research shows that the first years of the War of Independence, there is definitely a degree of, there's a social revolution going on. So Hidalgo, on one hand, could be seen as being extremely traditionalist in the way that he's defending the church and religion against the more secular elements of the Bourbon reforms. But on the other hand, they're talking about the abolition of slavery, they're talking about ending the caste system, they're talking about ensuring that merit is the only thing that should matter. And in that sense, there is a very strong social dimension. The social revolution dimension explains as well why Mexicans at the time were divided over whether they should support this initial movement. Because what they saw, that the criollos, the white Mexicans who were Mexican, who were born there, not Mexican yet, but Mexicanos as such. But because they were born there, even if their parents were Spanish, or their great-great-grandparents were Spanish, because they were born there, they had none of the political rights that Spaniards had. And you would have thought, understandably supported the movement of Hidalgo. But the social revolution dimension scared them. And so in fact you have a divided nation, which goes on to explain why for some historians we're talking about civil war. And it's a civil war between, they're not Mexicans yet, but it's between Mexicans. Not necessarily fighting over independence, or that is there, but they're fighting over whether they're going to try and change the social makeup and the kind of government that is going to be in place. With the added, and I'll say more about this in a second, the added curveball of the Constitution of Cádiz in Spain in 1812, which means that there may be liberal Mexicans, like Lorenzo de Zavala, who at the time would rather be part of a Spain governed by this progressive constitution, rather than follow priests that are leading this religious fanatical war from their perspective, which happens to also have an independent dimension to it. So we need to think about this, we need to think about Why did it last for 11 years? 11 years is a long time. I mean, we know what it's been like a year and a half, right? Or pandemic. 11 years of war, and that is a constant. Now, it's true that the way wars are, is that when you're in the war zone, that is constant, but not everybody's in the war zone all the time, and the experience of independence is very different in different parts of Mexico. But when it does hit, it hits bad. And even if you don't get hit directly, like Mexico City kind of avoids the horrors of war, it's still affected in terms of shortages of food, of people going and dying, of illnesses that come from the war zones. And so this is what, in a way, I want to talk about it. How did it come to an end the way it did in 1851, bearing in mind all the people we elected as the primary had. So let's kind of have a quick week. Let's remind ourselves of what would we understand. What is the world? Why did it start? So the big picture. Let's start with the big picture. We have to go back to what happened in Spain with the arrival of the Bourbons after the War of the Spanish Succession at the beginning of the 18th century. At the end of the Habsburgs, along came the Borbones, the Bourbons. They're still the one family now in Spain. And in the middle of the 18th century, you've got Charles III. And Charles III in Spain is seen as a great king. He's a reformist, he's a modernizer. It's about reducing the power of the church, secularizing society, and taxing the population to fund the modernization of Spain and its colonies. But that, from a Mexican perspective, means taxes. And what is felt as a second invasion of Spaniards. All these bureaucrats that are sent out to check that Mexicans are paying their taxes. And then we have the change of system to the intendencias. So you have intendentes monitoring the situation, the creation of standing armies, and an attack on the church, because the church is seen as superstitious, especially a Mexican church that has assimilated indigenous practices. And all of this is really, really resentful. It's resented by the local population. But it's a generation-long assault. I mean, we're talking about from 1767 is the expulsion of the Jesuits. And the expulsion of the Jesuits is over 2,000 intellectuals, teachers, people that the communities in Mexico love, right? Find themselves kicked out with the first wave of exiles, and they find themselves here in Italy. Clavijero is one of those exiles, and he writes a book, A History of Mexico, and he kicks off this book at the end of the 18th century saying, "Yo soy mexicano." So there is a beginning of an awareness of I am Mexican, and the Spaniards are kind of mistreating us. And then what makes it worse is that Charles IV, with Godoy, links up with Napoleon, Spain gets involved in all kinds of wars it shouldn't get involved with, and who's paying for these wars? Mexicans! Yeah. I know, I feel the same way. And so there's this backdrop. But ultimately, people are not thinking about independence, they're thinking about autonomy. They want autonomy, they want things to change, they want to have political power, they want to control what happens to taxes. They don't want these people in Madrid and the local viceroys in a way controlling them. That's what the real issue is, with all the racism that comes with that. And that is also felt strong. But then, I won't go into more of the measures, but one particular measure that constantly, I think about the adage which happened in 1804, has a massive impact, because basically Spain demands the church to call in all its loans to pay the war effort. And that means people end up, because the church is basically like lending money to people to buy their houses and whatnot, and calling these loans in is making people bankrupt. I mean, the economic impact is tremendous. All this is great, but what ultimately then opens the can of worms is that in 1808, Napoleon moves into Madrid, takes out, the two kings who are fighting, Charles IV and his son Ferdinand III, basically they're removed. Napoleon places his brother in the throne in Spain, and that creates a vacuum and a crisis of legitimacy that affects Spain and affects all of Spanish America. Because who do you obey? Who do you obey? Who do you obey? We can't obey the King of Spain, now Ferdinand III, because he's been locked up in a nice palace in France. We don't know it's a nice palace, but they've been locked up. We can't obey Joseph, because he's the brother of Napoleon, he's a usurper. And now these juntas have been formed of ayuntamientos in different parts of Spain that haven't been yet taken by the French army, and they claim they are sovereign and they represent the people whilst the king is a prisoner. And Iturrigaray, the viceroy in Mexico, Iturrigaray, in the summer of 1808, hearing what was happening in Spain, said, okay, we need to have a junta. And in liaison with the ayuntamiento of Mexico City, they decided to have a junta in Mexico to run the show. Just like the juntas in Cádiz and in Seville and in Valencia, except that the Spanish community in Mexico City suddenly said, wait a second, they don't quite say it like that, but I'm just kind of dramatizing. If we allow Iturrigaray and the Ayuntamiento to summon a junta or junta de gobierno here in Mexico, the next step is independence. And we need funds from Mexico to fund the war of the juntas and the rebel armies in Spain against the French invading army. So we don't allow that. There's a coup. There is a coup, funny enough, on another 16th of September, the 16th of September 1808, the Spaniards knock out Iturrigaray. And then we have a number of years where there are different viceroys who aren't proper viceroys, but they're kind of different Spaniards in Mexico City running show while Spain is in its own war and attempts against France. And it is in that context where the authority and the legitimacy of the Spanish government is gone. And so it is in that context that Hidalgo launches his plan, his Grito de Dolores, and what we have then is a war that, in a way, we have to think of it in terms of, I think we can think of it in sort of three moments, right? You have from 1810 to 1811, following the Grito de Dolores, is when the insurgency is at its most dominant, and it follows very successfully, very brutal, but they capture Guanajuato, Guadalajara, San Luis Potosí, the center of Mexico, Valladolid, then Morelia now, all of this falls into the hands of the insurgents. And Hidalgo is on this kind of campaign, but it's extremely violent. On the one hand, which is what scares the criollos, and that many of the revolutionaries, call them something that joined Hidalgo's army, are not discriminating between Spaniards and criollos. They're whites, they own haciendas, they go in kind of rampage, which makes them support the royalists. Hidalgo is made prisoner, he's caught, he's executed, Chihuahua, and then his head is chopped off and put in a cage in Guanajuato to remind people of the children insurgency. The brutality of the counter-revolution in Spain and the royalists is horrific, which in turn makes moderates that weren't in favor of independence now radicalized in view of what is happening. Morelos takes over. And then the second part of that is, if we've said 1810 to 1811, then we would be thinking 1811 to 1816, when Morelos becomes the main leader of the insurgency. But now, because of Felix Maria Calleja, who is the main commander of the Spanish army, they regain those cities. And so Morelos does his own, kind of follows his own, we have his own route. He goes to Cuautla, he liberates Oaxaca, he liberates Acapulco, makes his way to Jalapa. But eventually, as well, he's defeated. And by 1816, we can think in terms of, well, the Viceroy Apalaca, who arrives in 1816, talks about the war is over, we've won. And in that sense, from 1816 to 1821, the war changes. It's no longer the big confrontations of armies. We go into what is known as guerrilla warfare, and it's hit-and-run operations that are led by Guadalupe Victoria initially in the area of Veracruz with Veracruzanos, and Guerrero in the south, Nicolás Grado and his brothers. But ultimately, it seems as if the war is over, except these hit-and-run operations are constant. They continuously affect the economy, the route of commerce. And in the meantime, just to make things really complicated, so if we can think in terms of basically 1810 to 1816 as big battles, Puente Calderón, Uruguayan, big kind of field battle between the armies of the insurgency and the royalists. Between 1816 and 1821, we think more in terms of trying to govern from a royalist perspective in the context of guerrilla warfare and constant attacks on different economic routes. There is no stability. And if that is what is happening at one level, just to add complication to all of this, we have the fact that in Spain, in 1812, there are these cortes, Parliament which is convoked in Cadiz, protected by the Royal Navy, whilst the rest of Spain has been taken by the French, with deputies that are elected in Mexico that go and participate. So suddenly there is this possibility of participation in Spain in this rebel junta that hasn't been taken by the French. And they come up with this extraordinary constitution of Cadiz, 1812 constitution, which basically kind of has universal male suffrage and basically is offering representation for the American districts. So, and the experience of having elections in 1813 in Mexico, 1814, to elect who's going to represent Mexico, different parts of Mexico, in the Cortes. That, for the autonomistas, the autonomists, is much more sexy and attractive than the bloodshed of the Hidalgo movement, and I think there's a possibility here of influencing changing things. Except that when Ferdinand VII returns, he is an absolutist and ends the 1812 constitution, and so there is despair as to what is happening in Spain at the same time. But the key event, which in a way will facilitate the context for Iturbide, is that in Spain, on the 1st of January 1820, a Spanish officer, Rafael del Riego, launches a pronunciamiento from Cabezas de San Juan in the south of Spain. One, to prevent an expeditionary army, a massive expeditionary army that Spain has been putting together to go to the Americas to reconquer them. And two, to restore the Constitution of Cadiz. And although initially this pronunciamiento, this revolt doesn't seem to have much support, suddenly ayuntamientos, different garrisons across Spain make their oaths of allegiance to what has happened in Cabezas de San Juan, and there is a movement towards the capital, and King Ferdinand VII, in March 1820, is forced by these circumstances, by this pressure, by this lobbying, armed lobbying, to accept that the army is not leaving to go and conquer the Americas and to bring back the 1812 Constitution. And that has a massive impact on Mexico. One, again, the autonomists feel that this is a chance, so that again there are elections to send deputies, but it's already becoming very apparent, even though people go into that the Cortes de Cadiz are not actually kind of interested really in giving greater autonomy and power to the Americans. So that many of the ones who go out there already there's a half-hearted sense. But also, the Constitution of Cadiz coming in scares a lot of the serviles, as they were known, kind of the Borbonistas, the more traditionalist reactionary elements in New Spain, who maybe start thinking that maybe independence is not a bad idea if it means we can rescue King Ferdinand VII in this context of avoid being a liberal Spain. But they are a minority. Actually, what we find is that many people, there's an exhaustion after 11 years of war. And this creates a context where, again, the government representing the monarchy in Spain doesn't seem to have authority or legitimacy anymore in Mexico. And it is in this context that the conspiracy will result in Iturbide kind of changing sides and issuing his plan of Iguala. Now, there is one version of events where it is supposedly these serviles that kind of tell Iturbide to launch this, but it's to save Ferdinand VII from the liberals. But that historians have very rebutted this vision. And in fact, really, Iturbide is a liberal as well in his own way. What he realizes is that the war needs to stop, and that we are in a context where we may be able to find a route to independence that is not violent, that doesn't have consensus. And what he spends from the summer of 1820 up until February 1821 meeting people, writing to people. What we have is examples of that correspondence. And clearly a lot of people are involved. So it's not just Iturbide. Iturbide is one of many, except that Iturbide has the merit of, in a way, listening to everybody, sending people, kind of calming different perspectives, different commanders, but also speaking to ayuntamientos that are being formed as a result of, especially after the restoration of the Constitution of Cadiz and the Diputaciones Provinciales. And in the midst of that, he has been sent he's doing all of this whilst he has been sent to bring peace, pacify the area now, the state of Guerrero, where Vicente Guerrero, that insurgent, is still controlling that area and fighting. And we have 3 letters between him and Guerrero. Him first saying to Guerrero, come join me, let's have peace, let's stop. And I'm thinking of his plan. And Guerrero saying, no, or yes, but no, in the sense that only if it involves independence, and only if it involves an end to the caste, the castes. So we need that for me to kind of accept your work. And there's a meeting, we don't know what happened at the meeting. There is the mythical abrazo de Acatenta, there's this hug of Acatenta, which is illustrated there. We don't know actually whether that happened. It would be nice, but we don't know for sure. In fact, the one person who said it happened was trying to, in a way, show Iturbide in a bad light, kind of came up with this, reported this sort of happened, so that the world saw what a traitor he was, that he planned Guerrero. But the moment that Guerrero is on board, the plan Iguala is on board. And the plan Iguala is an extraordinary document. And I go, you have to read it. You have to read it. You can read it in Spanish if you want. In the St. Andrews has a website of pronunciamientos. You can read the document there for free. And it's an extraordinary document because Iturbide did the impossible. He pleased everybody. This is a document that starts off with a preamble where he basically praises Spain and Spaniards and says, we are who we are ready to go. Thanks to the Spaniards. This is kind of. But it's about independence. And we want an independence where everybody who is here, whether they are European, African, Asiatic, Asian, if you live here, you are Americanos. You are part of my project. So it's an inclusive vision. And he offers to the Spaniards the chance of, join us. I have a union. You're not going to be kicked out. If we go back to the origins of the war of independence, it's about kicking out the Spaniards. I mean, Hidalgo doesn't say, he says, you can go, we don't want to kill you, but we're going out of here. But no, he's offering the possibility to stay. And I won't go through all the articles, obviously, but I'll just go through some of the basic ones very quickly so you get a sense of what he's talking about. So Article 1 of the Plan of Iguala is that this new country, which is now exists, I mean, this is the wonderful thing about pronunciamiento, they're magic in the sense that when you launch a pronunciamiento, it's like now it's de facto, this is the law, right? So this is our country, and in this country, the Catholic religion will be the only religion, and that's it, right? And that resonates with the Catholic population, but it's also, it's at the heart of what Hidalgo Morelos were about. If you read Hidalgo Morelos, in a way it's about religion. It's not, there is a big grievance about how religion has been mistreated and disrespected by the Spaniards. It's about bringing back the faith in that way. And Iturbide is good now. And of course, religion will be one of the colors of the next fight, which is, we owe that to him. The second article is the absolute independence of his nation, of his kingdom. So there is no ambivalence there. We are independent. Now, yes, this is it. Article 3, it will be a monarchical government. But then, that isn't so kind of, we shouldn't be shocked or scandalized by that because Mexicans were monarchical then. The majority didn't know anything different. The only republic was in the US. They see what had happened in France, and then Napoleon had fallen to an emperor anyway. No? I mean, we all know a republic is better than a monarchy, obviously. Go out into the streets and tell my fellow Brits that we should adopt a republic. See what they tell you. It's the same thing for Mexicans. The idea of a republic is an alien concept. So him saying monarchy is not that shocking. But he's saying, with a constitution, so it's a constitutional monarchy. That's the liberalism that Iturbide has. He's also listening to that. But actually, in the rest of the document, is not the constitution of Cádiz. We will have a new constitution. So he pleases the Galitanos, those who want the constitution of Cádiz, because it's a constitution, but he pleases those who don't want the constitution of Cádiz because it will be our own constitution. Or we will retain the constitution of Cádiz whilst we get our house sorted. So
It's pleasing everyone. In Article 4, he offers the throne to Ferdinand VII. And if Ferdinand VII doesn't want it, to somebody else in the royal dynasty. But interestingly, in Article 8, he says if Ferdinand VII doesn't want to come, then the junta of the regency will decide who should be crowned. Now, some of us may see in that already a cunning plan, that he's kind of lining it up so that he could become, maybe. But it's ultimately like, I mean, did he know? Did he really think Ferdinand VII would say no and not come? I don't think he knew that for sure. I mean, it was. And then he said it will be defended by the army of the three guarantees. And this is the moment that he brings the army together. And the War of Independence had militarized society. So there is a degree there of politicized the military. So you've got an army, which means that this isn't just empty negotiation. There are weapons to support what the leaders will have. And perhaps I'll just finish talking about the Iguala, just saying that, of course, he goes on to embrace this idea of that there are no kind of caste differences. We are all Mexicans. And it's all about merit. Only virtue and merit will be the only thing that determines whether people can prosper in this new country. And of course, it ends with a call for religion, independence, and union, which will eventually be represented in the colours of the Mexican flag. And this document is remarkable precisely because it does that. It pleases everyone. And in so doing, it results in the achievement of independence. And we started off by saying how wonderful it is that we are today celebrating the 27th of September, 200 years from Cuban independence, here in the Mexican Embassy here in London. But interestingly, in Mexico, the Bank of Mexico decided to issue a new 20 peso note, which is there is illustrated with the entrance of the Grande Army into Mexico City, and there it's small. Not as big as Iguala on the left, but he's there. He'll be there on his horse marching in. And those months were months of negotiation and tense negotiations. There were some battles, it wasn't just entirely peaceful. As I said earlier, Veracruz refused to accept this until Santana had to take Veracruz by force with very cold battles. But everybody kind of buys into this. Even Juan de Oronoju, who is the political chief who has come to replace the viceroy and has been sent by the Cortes, so he's a liberal who already, because of this whole network of conspiracy, he sort of knows this is going on. And is prepared to, in the treaties of Córdoba, that were signed in August 1821, to basically say, okay, we will recognize this independence. I'll have to see what Ferdinand said. Of course, Oronoju dies soon after his arrival in Mexico City, and Ferdinand says no way. And in fact, Spain doesn't recognize the independence of Mexico until 1836. Nor does the Latin, which causes its own problems. But certainly. But that's when it happened. And from then on, we move into a new moment in history. It's the formation of the Mexican state. It's whether it should be a federal republic or not, whether it should be a monarchy or not, whether we should give more power to the executive than the legislative branch. It's the beginning of the wonderful story of Mexican history. And it starts on the 27th of September. And just to end, I mean, my recent research has been on a book which is coming out in the spring, which is entitled The Grammar of Civil War. And it's not a new theory, not something as exciting as a new theory, but it's a new framework to try to understand civil war. And I use the Guerilla Warfare, the Civil War from 1857-61 as my case study. But I look at the grammar of outcome, which is what kind of grammatical principles you need to bring a war to an end. And I argue that there are three ways in civil war can end. One is through military victory. Most civil wars end with military victory. Statistically, that's how it ends. Or through negotiation and peace talks. It's more the exception than the rule, but that is the case. Well, or what I describe as a fossilization of the conflict, fossilizing itself. Nobody wins, and so you then have different areas where there is retrenchment, and for maybe like Colombia, years and years, or moments of peace that exposed what that's what I'm calling the fossilization of the conflict. In a way, with Guerilla, we have resolution through kind of peace talks and forceful negotiation. Yes, there's no different guarantees. And for that to happen, according to my grammar of civil war, what do we need? We need a shared realization that neither side can win the war. That is the case. Guerrero, Guadalupe, Victoria lost in the forests of Veracruz. They know that they can continue this different run operation, but they can't bring about it back. But on the other hand, it's constant. They haven't given up. The war is always there. The royalists are unable to bring the war to an end. So it makes somebody like Iturbide, okay, let's listen. Let's try and find another way out. Not just him, but Guerrero as well and others. There has to be a generalized sense of war exhaustion on the part of the population at large, as well as the belligerent forces. After 11 years, absolutely. This has gone on and on and on. It's elastic. And a de-escalation of the violence that turns peace into something positive and desirable. I think the moment that a family when it comes out, and suddenly there is the possibility of peace. That makes peace really kind of exciting. And that it's going to be a peace that can be achieved without violence. That's the magical aspect of the plan of God. So even something like Lorenzo Zavala, radical, in his kind of chronicle history of early Mexico, compares the Iguala movement and the Iturbide movement. He will stress how the Iturbide movement is a peaceful movement. It achieves independence because it's peaceful. So how do we end? How do we end today's talk? Well, Veronica Zárate, who I've already mentioned, has in a recent study that I think is about to come out, in studying how the 27th of September has been commemorated or not, talks about the fact that the commemoration, the achievement of independence, la consumación de la independencia, represented the reconciliation of opposed sides, of rivals. And maybe in commemorating this, it was a way of looking for reconciliation beyond those conflicts and to bring ourselves together to achieve the common good. And I think that if that is a good reason for celebrating the 27th of September, I sign up to that. So, yeah.
Thank you, Professor Fowler, for this great talk. Very enlightening. Fundamentally, as Guerilla Warfare would say, shedding new light on this topic. I think we have a few minutes for short Q&A. If there are questions from our audience, please pose them. Just state your name and your question, your brief, please, and Professor Fowler will be ready to answer. Join me once again in giving a round of applause to Professor Fowler.
Yes.
So I'm Mauricio Garcia from the University of St. Andrews. And my question is if this was a real possibility for peace and it was so well constructed, why did it fall apart after only a few years?
Very good question. Timothy Adler, who has studied Iturbide and Iguala, argues that in a way the greatest virtue of the Iguala was also the greatest sin, in the sense that it allowed all kinds of people to come together, but they all came together for very different reasons. And it was only once independence was consolidated that then those differences came back to the fore. In terms of what these people wanted Mexico to be. And that in part, but I think that there are many reasons why things didn't go the way that they should have done, very quickly. 11 years of war had destroyed the economy, so that actually the first government of Guerilla inherited a debt of, I believe, 70 million pesos to begin, so there was just already we were starting in a really bad situation. Communications in the country were very difficult for trade as well. But then a whole part of the international community didn't recognize independence either, so there was a hostility of Spain until 1836. So only two countries, obviously the Spanish American republics recognized independence, but it was only Britain and the US that recognized independence de facto in 1822. And that helped, but already, I mean, by then there were big divisions as to what people hoped Mexico should be. I think that. And clearly, 11 years of war, there are scars. It's okay for Guerrero and really to hug in Acatemplan if they did, and temporarily put their differences aside. But people were scarred by the war and the retaliatory nature of the war. It's perhaps not surprising that Vicente Guerrero was there. I talked about Will being executed in 1824. Guerrero was executed in 1831 by the government of Anastasio Bustamante. Bustamante had fought against Guerrero in the War of Independence. And in a way, there is a kind of, those conflicts are gone, and they are in the background as well.
Closely related to that, my name is Oscar Alvarez. I wanted to learn your comments about in the grammar of civil war, which seems to be very useful for understanding the dialogue that is taking part between not necessarily two people, two organizations, but what happened in that grammar when the conversation from the perspective of European countries, what other forces may have been in place, because I understand Spain actually recognized Mexican independence until 1836. So probably there are some other forces
Absolutely.
in the dialogue.
Absolutely. I have, as I didn't mention it because it wasn't such a big part of this process, but in my grammar, I also have it as the successful intercession of a third party, neighboring country, international delegation. Now, there isn't that specifically in this case in terms of there isn't an international power involved in this process of boundary well. But immediately afterwards, yes, there is, in the sense that clearly independence is something the British want because of free trade. Right? Britain has a big interest in silver in Mexico. But Britain is in a bit of a difficult situation because Britain has, during the Peninsular War, or the War of Spanish Independence, supported the Spaniards against the French. And they foresee a potential next war against France, so they don't want to alienate Spain. But they want the independence of Mexico because they want to get involved in free trade. But clearly, having British recognition is a crucial moment, as is that of the United States. But Britain is one of the big powers, and that gives Mexico confidence. That, as well as allows its independence to be more firmly consolidated. And you have this double-edged sword that then there is British investment in Mexico. So between 1825 and 1826, British loans, massive British loans going to Mexico. And that's something that is a boost to the economy. And you have the arrival of British mining ventures that kind of link up with Mexico ones to help open the mines that have been flooded during the War of Independence and are unusable. But it was probably wrong because the interest rates are insane. And by 1827, Mexico has already defaulted on the loan. And so there was known as the deuda inglesa, debt, that is not paid off until 1886. And that would be a problem for the whole of early Mexico because whenever there's no money, it has to be paid to the British interest. But that international element is crucial and of course you have all the Spanish American republics, although they're in the same kind of situation, but there is obviously a recognition of Colombia, or that again is helping. But there isn't the involvement in the Mexican War of Independence you have in the War of Venezuela, where you have mercenaries if we're going to criticize them, or adventurers if we're going to be kind of upbeat about them, but all of those British soldiers who fought against Napoleon also
we don't know where to go afterwards, and kind of need action. That joint Bolívar, there's none of that in the Mexican case. It's much more sentimental. Thank you.
Also related to that question, my name is Stephanie from related to the question of international involvement before the independence. So you spoke about the loans, like the British loans, but I grew up in Mexico, like with the story of how there was American involvement, how they supported with weapons. That was like the official history. And the other day, like this days, of course, with the commemoration, there's lots of talk about history and revisiting history. And I was listening to a podcast where they were saying that it was actually the other way around, that in the War of Independence in Mexico, there was support for U.S. independence, that there was lots of influence and money that was given from Mexico to the U.S. and not from the U.S. to Mexican War of Independence. So basically, is there any proof or evidence of either weapons or money actually being channeled to Hidalgo Morelos and the War of Independence from anywhere?
There is some evidence of purchases of American weapons, but they were not given. I mean, it wasn't a kind of a US kind of support. Certainly a mission was sent out to kind of buy weapons and help, but I mean it's not that at that point in time also the United States were involved in their own conflict with Britain at the time, so they weren't in a position because although there's a war of independence, then in 1812 they had their own conflict again, so they weren't in a position necessarily to. But they are quick coming in 2022 to kind of recognize independence, definitely. And of course, the Monroe Doctrine is from 1823, where there is this declaration that the US took it upon themselves to protect the Americans from European imperialism. So in that sense, that is there. But yes, I wouldn't know. The Mexicans have supported the American War of Independence. It's possible, but I don't think would have been individuals if that is the case.
And from France, any weapons or money going from France to Mexico in War of Independence?
I'm not aware of it. I mean, it's not. I mean, obviously, weapons are a problem for the army on the ground. And Juan Ortiz Escamilla, who's a historian of the Veracruzana, who has worked on the army significantly. And what you find is a lot of in the early stages, the insurgents are basically, if they beat the royalists, they keep their guns and cannons. They try and make their own, but they're not really getting weapons from France or from the United States. I mean, just as a typical example, Morelos has as a cannon that follows him around, it's known as El Niño, and it was a little cannon that the Galeana brothers had in their hacienda for fiestas, right? It was a kind of cannon that made a kind of bang at the beginning of fiesta. That is their weapon. And it's only in battles that they take guns and whatnot. So they're not particularly well supplied either. Yeah. I think it was
Professor Gonzalez, Director of Mexican Center for Mexican Studies here at the South.
So thank you, Will, for this fantastic talk. And I was wondering about the ideology, about the thoughts process behind the things that were going on at the time, and their connection, I suppose, to the illustration and to the circulation of books and the ideas that had to led to building nations, which is a very international process. I think that's what Stephanie was implying, that you declare that a nation exists, whether they agree or not will take some years, but still it is that kind of nascency and fashion to proceed with that. And I was wondering how illustrated would Iturbide have been? Were there books circulating? Were there support for their ideas that could be read somewhere? Or were they just copying the United States? Well, the name was, I don't know, or copying the thousand words.
I think what relatively recent research is showing is that
is not one thing or another. The ideas do circulate, clearly, and the ideas of the Enlightenment are in Mexico. But there is the Inquisition as well, which is trying to stamp out circulation of that. The Cali Constitution allows freedom of the press and freedom of publication. So there are bursts where books circulate, but many books are circulating. People are aware of the ideas. And very quickly you can see they quote Montesquieu, they quote Rousseau, they quote Diderot. They're all there, Voltaire, so it's there, definitely. But there is a degree of Mexicanization that brings somehow of that. And I think there are a number of historians, Guerilla Warfare in the CIDE, who has looked at how, in fact, the adoption of ideas is then reinvented from within. So that, I mean, the 1824 Constitution is a Mexican product. Yes, it brings in ideas from the American Constitution, ideas from the Guerilla Constitution, but it then does something different. So I think there is that. And Iturbide himself, yes, he would have read some stuff, but he's also very much military man, so maybe it's not. But interestingly, how people reinvent things or invent things. I mean, we were talking about monarchy earlier. Hidalgo is the person who calls himself Su Alteza Serenísima. And so that's the title he invents, which is monarchical, but it isn't. It's monarchical, but it's not a proper monarchy. Yeah, we have the official history is kind of forgotten that, and we always remember that Santa Anna is Su Alteza Serenísima. Santa Anna became Su Alteza Serenísima in 1853 in an attempt to create a sense of national identity, because after the war against the United States, he feared that there wasn't enough of a sense of national identity. He needed Mexican traditions. And one thing he said, well, let's restore proper Mexican titles, and Su Alteza Serenísima is a proper Mexican title because Hidalgo called himself that. But that's kind of go.
Sorry, do we have time for a question?
Yes.
So, sorry, is it me?
Yeah.
I wanted to go back to Vida's question. By the way, my name is Luis, and I did study advanced economics, although now I work for a software company in Edinburgh, so totally out of the way. And I love history, especially this part of the Mexican history. I wanted to ask about why do you think it has been, there's like a long, okay, it's a long last question. I believe Iturbide is a mixed character. I found out earlier in that he actually met with Hidalgo after meeting with Morelos from Charo to Indaparateo, and that he proposed you should join our cause, and Iturbide said, no, for me, it seemed like Iturbide was just at the right place and he could be replaced. So he could have been him, it could be another Caudillo, we were playing with them, they were royalists. Why should we believe in a mixed character like that? I'm not saying, Hidalgo was a hero or Iturbide was a hero, but it seems like there's a big difference between the two ideas of the nation. I grew up in León, which is not far from Guanajuato. Hacienda de Correjo is 20 minutes away, and I grew up not really believing in Hidalgo until like 2 years ago when I started reading his life. And it seems obvious now about the character of Iturbide. Why do you think there is a strong need to keep rescuing a mixed character like that? Apart from the fact that the only thing that he did was bringing about peace, that was, and my coach pointed out, that was, that was gone after a couple of years. Sorry, that was a long question.
No,
I'm really curious about your opinion.
It's an excellent question. In fact, just before I answer the question, my last public talk before this talk in March 2020 was in the Alhóndiga in Guanajuato. So that was my last possibility to speak to real people. Anyway, because I'm not here to say we should be celebrating or commemorating Iturbide. I'm not saying we should put statues to him. In fact, I'm not saying we should put statues to Hidalgo, or that is for officialdom to decide and listen to what people want to represent. And I think that we choose our heroes not so much because of what they did in the past, but what we want to say about us now and looking to the future. So in that sense, if Iturbide is problematic, for the president, then maybe we should. I agree.
On the other hand, the same can be said for Hidalgo, the same can be said for Juarez, the same can be said for, they are all mixed characters. They all do horrible things at some point, but they also all do extraordinary things. Now, me as a historian, I'm not actually interested in the celebrations of one and the celebrations of others. I'm interested in understanding these people and recognizing the role they play. And at least getting things correct in the sense of not. So, for example, people say that Santa Ana sold half of the country to the US. It's not true. So my role here as a historian is that it didn't happen. Stop saying that. But a separate thing is for me to say, let's have a statue of Santa Ana in the Port of Veracruz. There may be Veracruzanos who would agree, but I'm not saying that. But in the context of commemoration and remembrance, certainly if we are talking about celebrating independence, the man had an important role. Yes, it could have been anybody in the sense that he is the sum of the parts, but he was the individual who did it. And it's like in all of these contexts, there is always something that there is an individual that just happens to know how to make use of that context to do that. But, I mean, and then I'm not going to be counterfactual, but, well, I think I've said it. I don't know if that answers your question. But in a separate context, I was talking to in a Texan online conference about the Texan War of Independence. Of course, the problem that many Texans have now is that their heroes were all slave owners. So they're now having to grapple with, well, do you celebrate David Crockett? Do you celebrate these people? David Bowie, when James Bowie when it's a problem of kind of heroes and villains. Because life is complex and people are complex. Yeah.
Time for
Why
last
one
questions.
last question? Why did the Spaniards took 15 years to sign the document saying that Mexico was an independent country? It was on the 28th of December 1936. Why that 15 years?
Why is it 15 years? Well, whilst Ferdinand VII was king of Spain, there was no way he was going to recognize England. So one is you've got Ferdinand VII is dead, so it's a different context in Spain. But after 15 years, there's the realization that Spain is missing out. Spain is missing out. Whilst, British commerce is doing well with Mexico, other parts, I think there's a change of administration. But the Spanish political class remains kind of problematic about Mexico. I mean, even the first envoy that arrives from Spain to Mexico in 1839, it's quite disparaging about Mexico. I mean, that's quite and then his successor intervened to bring a monarchy. So they're not particularly helpful. But having said that, I think it's just the context of change.
And we cannot recognize the people who bring the document both from Spain to Mexico, the name of these people, to say, okay, we will sign the document, Mexico, you're free.
We could. I think we could do that going back to what we choose to celebrate. But I think by celebrating, I guess, the 16th or the 27th, we are empowering the Mexicans who made the decision to become independent to start it and end it, rather than wait for the Spaniards to acknowledge that Mexico became free. And I guess that's the way of looking at it. But from a Spanish perspective, yes. In the same way that Mexico did not recognize the independence of Texas in 1836. But they had to after the war against the United States. So again, I mean, you can enter with just one comment, which is, again, going back to understand the context. We talk about independence and we talk about Mexico, but in 1821, what was formed was the empire, the Mexican Empire. And that included the whole Central America. It didn't just include kind of the Mexico today. And it went as far as Utah, the northern Colorado. I mean, the Mexican Empire was vast. And then in 1822, with the application of the card, 1823, the application of the collapse of Iguala, then the United Provinces of Central America broke away from the Mexican Empire, with the exception of Chiapas, where the elites in Chiapas decided to stay. And that explains why Chiapas is not a republic in Central America, which is against the way things happen. So to be Mexican now is not necessarily what it was to be Mexican
but it was free of Spanish domination. That's a fact.
Thank you very much. Many thanks to all of you who joined us today here at the Mexican Embassy, and to our audience following us on social media. Thank you for also tuning in. Thank you.